The barn door hung half open, swinging slow in the wind that came down from the hills. Inside, the air smelled like old hay and something worse, fear, sweat, the kind of desperation that clings to wood and leather long after people are gone. She knelt in the dirt near the back wall, wrists bound with frayed rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Her dress, once pale blue, now stained grey with dust and something darker, clung to her shoulders. Her hair fell across her face, tangled and damp with sweat. She didn't look up when the footsteps approached. "Don't look there," she whispered. Not a command, a plea. The words were so quiet they almost disappeared into the creak of the barn's settling beams. But Caleb heard them. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, dust from the road still clinging to his boots. He'd come into town for supplies, nothing more. A sack of flour, some nails, maybe a new bridle if the price was fair. He hadn't come looking for this. The auctioneer, a man with a thin moustache and a voice like gravel scraped over tin, stood on an overturned crate near the center of the barn. His coat was too fine for a place like this, tailored and dark, the kind of thing a man wore when he wanted to pretend he wasn't doing what he was doing. "Next lot," the auctioneer called, his voice carrying through the barn like a preacher at a funeral. Young woman, 22, maybe 23, no family, no debts outstanding, clean bill of health far as we know. Caleb's stomach turned. It was 1870, 6 years since the war had ended, 6 years since Lincoln's proclamation had made this kind of thing illegal. But out here, in the valleys west of the Missouri Breaks, the law was a thin thing. It bent, it broke, and men like the auctioneer knew exactly how far they could push before anyone with a badge bothered to ride out and stop them. The woman on the ground didn't move. Her hands trembled against the rope. Her head stayed down. "Don't look there," she said again, softer this time. Caleb felt his chest tighten. He should have turned around, should have walked back out into the daylight and pretended he'd never seen this. It wasn't his business. He was just a rancher, 38 years old, with a small spread 10 miles south and no interest in trouble. But he didn't move. There were maybe 15 men scattered around the barn. Most of them leaned against posts or sat on crates, faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. A few whispered to each other. One man near the front spat into the dirt and grinned. "She got spirit," the man called out. The auctioneer smiled. "She's got enough. Quiet type, though, won't give you much trouble." Caleb's jaw tightened. The woman's shoulders hunched forward, like she was trying to fold in on herself. Her breathing was shallow, quick. He could see the rise and fall of her back even from where he stood. "Starting bid," the auctioneer said, "is $50. Do I hear 50? Silence. The wind pushed through the barn again, stirring the dust into lazy spirals. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped its hoof against the ground. $50, the auctioneer repeated. "Come on, gentlemen, that's a fair price for a woman who can cook, clean, mend." 60, Caleb said. The word came out before he'd even realized he was going to speak. His voice cut through the barn like a blade, sharp and clear. Every head turned toward him. The auctioneer's smile widened. 60 from the man in the doorway. Do I hear 70? No one spoke. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know why he'd done it, didn't know what he was going to do next. All he knew was that he couldn't stand there and watch this happen without doing something. "Going once," the auctioneer said. The woman on the ground lifted her head just slightly, not enough to see her face, just enough that Caleb caught a glimpse of her profile, the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek, the way her lips pressed together like she was holding back a scream. "Going twice." Caleb took a step forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "Sold," the auctioneer said, "to the gentleman in the doorway for $60. The barn erupted into low murmurs. A few men laughed. One of them clapped Caleb on the shoulder as he passed, grinning like they'd just shared a joke. Caleb barely felt it. He walked toward the woman slowly, his boots scraping against the dirt floor. The auctioneer hopped down from his crate and met him halfway, hand extended. "Cash or trade?" the auctioneer asked. Caleb pulled a small leather pouch from his coat pocket and counted out the bills without looking at the man's face. His hands didn't shake, but his throat felt tight. "Pleasure doing business," the auctioneer said, pocketing the money. He gestured toward the woman. "She's all yours, ropes included." Caleb didn't answer. He walked past the auctioneer and crouched down in front of the woman. She flinched when he moved, her whole body goy. "NG rigid." "I'm not going to hurt you," Caleb said quietly. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Caleb reached for the rope around her wrists, his fingers working the knot loose. It was tied tight, cruelly so, and it took him a moment to free her. When the rope finally fell away, she pulled her hands into her lap and rubbed at the raw skin, her breath hitching. "Can you stand?" Caleb asked. She nodded, but didn't move. Caleb stood and offered his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, like she didn't understand what it meant. Then, slowly, she reached up and let him pull her to her feet. She swayed slightly, unsteady. Caleb caught her elbow to keep her from falling, and she jerked away from his touch like she'd been burned. "Easy," he said. "I'm just trying to help." Her eyes met his for the first time. They were dark, almost black in the dim light of the barn, and filled with something Caleb couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also anger, and beneath that, something colder. She didn't say anything. Caleb picked up his hat from where he'd dropped it and gestured toward the door. "Let's go." She followed him, but kept her distance, 3 feet behind him always, like a shadow that didn't want to get too close. Outside, the sunlight was harsh and unforgiving. Caleb squinted against it and led the way to his horse, a gray mare tied to a post near the edge of the barn. He untied the reins and turned back to the woman. "You can ride with me," he said. "It's about 10 miles to my place." She looked at the horse, then at him. Her expression didn't change. Caleb swung up into the saddle and held out his hand again. This time she took it. He pulled her up behind him, and she settled onto the horse's back without a word. Her hands hovered near his sides, not quite touching. "Hold on," Caleb said. She didn't. He nudged the mare forward, and they rode out of town in silence. The wind picked up as they left the valley, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Caleb didn't look back. But as they crested the first hill, he felt the woman's hands finally grip the sides of his coat. "Just barely. Just enough." The ranch came into view just as the sun started to dip toward the western hills. It wasn't much, a small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that needed patching, a corral with 3 horses grazing in the fading light. But it was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where a man could disappear and forget the rest of the world existed. Caleb brought the mare to a stop near the porch and dismounted. He offered his hand to the woman again, and this time she took it without hesitation. Her legs wobbled when her feet hit the ground, and Caleb steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. She pulled away immediately. "You can sleep in the cabin," Caleb said, nodding toward the door. "I'll take the barn." She looked at him like he'd just spoken a language she didn't understand. "I didn't buy you to own you," Caleb said quietly. "You're free to go whenever you want, but if you need a place to stay for a while, you can stay here." Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" It was the first word she'd spoken to him since the barn. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in days. Caleb didn't have a good answer. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her, because it was the right thing to do. She laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "You think that makes it better?" "No," Caleb admitted. "I don't." She crossed her arms over her chest, her jaw tight. "You paid money for me. You handed that man $60 like I was a horse or a sack of grain, and now you want me to thank you." "I don't want anything," Caleb said. "Everybody wants something." Caleb didn't argue. He turned and walked toward the cabin, pushing the door open and stepping inside. The woman hesitated, then followed. The cabin was small and spare. A single room with a bed in one corner, a wood stove in the other, and a table with 2 chairs near the window. Everything was clean but worn, the kind of place that had been lived in but never loved. Caleb lit a lamp and set it on the table. The warm light filled the room, pushing back the shadows. "There's bread and dried meat in the cupboard," he said. "Help yourself. I'll be outside if you need anything." He started toward the door, but her voice stopped him. "What's your name?" He turned back. Caleb Merrick." Her expression changed. It was subtle, just a flicker of something in her eyes, but Caleb saw it. "You know that name?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, and her breathing quickened. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Merrick." Caleb felt his chest go cold. "You're Samuel Merrick's son," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb's throat went dry. He nodded slowly. The woman took a step back, her eyes wide. "Your father sold out my family." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He opened mouth, but no sound came out. 8 years ago," the woman continued, her voice shaking now, "after the war ended, your father told the Union soldiers that my pa had been hiding Confederate deserters, said we were traitors. They came to our farm and burned it to the ground." Caleb felt the floor tilt beneath him. He remembered that night. He'd been 29, still living at his father's ranch, still trying to make sense of a world that had been torn apart by 5 years of war. He remembered his father coming home late, smelling like whiskey and smoke. He remembered the way his father had laughed when Caleb asked where he'd been. They had good land, his father had said, real good land, and now it's ours. Caleb had left the next morning. He'd ridden west and never looked back. "I didn't know," Caleb said quietly. "I swear to God, I didn't know it was your family." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "My mother died in that fire, my little brother too, he was 6 years old." Caleb's knees felt weak. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "I'm sorry." "Sorry," she repeated, her voice flat. "Everybody says that after." "I tried to stop him," Caleb said, the words tumbling out now. "When I found out what he was planning, I rode to your farm to warn you, but by the time I got there, it was already too late. The soldiers were already there. The fire had already started." The woman stared at him, her face pale. "You were there." "I was there," Caleb said. "I saw the smoke, I heard the screaming, and I did nothing." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Caleb had ever felt. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him like he was a ghost. "I've been carrying that with me ever since," Caleb said. "Every day, every night, I see that fire, I hear those screams, and I know that I didn't do enough." The woman's hands were trembling now. "What's your name?" she asked again. "You already know my name." "No," she said. "What's your name? Not your father's, yours." "Caleb," he said. "Just Caleb." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she turned away and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "My name is Clara," she said quietly. "Clara Whitfield." Caleb closed his eyes. He'd known the name once. He'd seen it carved into a wooden sign near the entrance to the farm, but he'd never known the faces, never known the people his father had destroyed. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said again. She didn't turn around. "Sorry doesn't bring them back." "No," Caleb said, "it doesn't." The wind rattled the shutters. Outside, the horses whinnied softly. "You should go," Clara said. Caleb nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He walked to the door and stepped outside, pulling it closed behind him. The night air was cold against his face. He stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the dark hills. And for the first time in 8 years, he let himself remember everything he'd been trying to forget. 3 days passed. Clara stayed in the cabin. Caleb stayed in the barn. They didn't speak. He left food on the porch every morning, bread, eggs, sometimes a piece of salted pork, and by evening it was always gone. But he never saw her take it. On the 4th morning, Caleb was repairing a section of fence near the corral when he heard the hoofbeats. He straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Three riders crested the hill to the east, moving fast. Dust rose behind them in a pale cloud, and the morning sun glinted off something metal, a badge, maybe, or a rifle barrel. Caleb's stomach sank. He walked toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the riders. They slowed as they approached, spreading out in a loose line. The man in the center was older, maybe 50, with a thick gray beard and a star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Dalton. Caleb had only met the man once, years ago, but he knew the reputation. Dalton was the kind of lawman who cared more about order than justice, the kind who turned a blind eye when it suited him. The kind who'd been at that auction in the barn. Dalton reined his horse to a stop a few feet from where Caleb stood. His eyes swept over the ranch, taking in the cabin, the barn, the fence line. Then he looked at Caleb. "Morning, Merrick," Dalton said. Caleb didn't answer. "I'm here on official business," Dalton continued. "Got a complaint from a man in town. Says you took something that belongs to him." "I didn't take anything," Caleb said evenly. "I paid for it." Dalton's smile was thin. "That's a matter of interpretation." One of the other riders, a younger man with a scar across his cheek, shifted in his saddle. "Where is she?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not your concern." "Oh, I think she is," Dalton said. "See, the man who filed the complaint says you interfered with a legal transaction. Says you took the woman before the paperwork was finer." "Lies. The paperwork," Caleb said slowly, "for a transaction that's been illegal for 6 years." Dalton's smile widened. "Now, Caleb, you know as well as I do that the law out here is flexible, and if a man wants to sell his property, well, that's his right." "She's not property. That's not for you to decide." The cabin door opened. Both men turned. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands at her sides, her face pale but steady. She looked at Dalton, then at Caleb, then back at Dalton. "Get inside," Caleb said quietly. She didn't move. Dalton's grin widened. "Well, there she is. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. There's been a misunderstanding, and we need to sort it out." "There's no misunderstanding," Clara said. Her voice was calm, but Caleb could hear the tremor beneath it. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Dalton's smile faded. "That's not your choice, ma'am." "Get inside, Clara," Caleb said again, his voice harder now, "before it's too late." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, Caleb thought she might listen, but then she shook her head. "No," she said. Dalton sighed and swung down from his horse. The other two riders followed suit, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. Dalton walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Ma'am, I don't want to make this difficult," Dalton said, "but if you don't come willingly, I'll have to." Caleb stepped between them. Dalton stopped, his eyes narrowed. "Move aside, Merrick." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Dalton's hand moved toward his gun, and Caleb's did the same. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the hill to the east, came the sound of more hoofbeats. Dalton turned, his hand still on his gun. 5 riders appeared over the crest of the hill, moving at a steady trot. Caleb recognized 2 of them, old ranch hands from the neighboring spreads, men he'd worked with over the years, men who'd heard the stories. The riders fanned out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle around Dalton and his men. None of them drew their guns. They didn't have to. "Dalton," one of them said. His name was Harris, a grizzled man in his 60s with a limp from an old war wound. "Heard you were out this way. Thought we'd ride along and see what all the fuss was about." Dalton's jaw tightened. "This is official business, Harris. It doesn't concern you." "Maybe," Harris said, "but Caleb's a neighbor, and out here that means it concerns all of us." The other riders nodded. One of them spat into the dirt. Dalton looked around at the men, then back at Caleb. His hand moved away from his gun. "This isn't over," Dalton said quietly. "Yes," Caleb said, "it is." Dalton held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. The other two riders followed. They mounted up in silence, and Dalton looked back one last time. "You're making a mistake, Merrick," he said. Caleb didn't answer. Dalton spurred his horse forward, and the three men rode off toward the east. Caleb watched until they disappeared over the hill, his heart still hammering in his chest. Harris rode up beside him and leaned down from his saddle. "You all right, Caleb?" Caleb nodded. "Thanks for coming." "That's what neighbors do," Harris said. He glanced toward the cabin where Clara still stood in the doorway. "She all right?" "I think so," Caleb said. Harris nodded and straightened in his saddle. "You need anything, you let us know." "I will." The riders turned and headed back the way they'd come, their horses kicking up dust as they rode. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching them go. Then he turned back to the cabin. Clara was still standing in the doorway. Her arms were wrapped around herself and her face was pale, but she was smiling. "Just barely. Just enough." So here's the question that changes everything. If you were Caleb, knowing what he knew about his father's sins, would you have opened that door? Would you have let her in, knowing that forgiveness might never come? Take a breath, pour yourself a cup of tea, and think about that. Because what happened next wasn't about redemption, not yet. It was about something quieter, something harder. That night Caleb sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. The air was cool, and the stars were sharp and bright overhead. He could hear the horses moving in the corral, their soft snorts and the rustle of hay. The cabin door opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, looking out at the hills. Caleb set down his knife and the piece of wood. "Couldn't sleep." "No," she said. "Me neither." They stood in silence for a while. The wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "Why did you do it?" Clara asked suddenly. Caleb looked up at her. "Do what?" "Stay. ND between me and the sheriff. Risk everything for me." Caleb thought about that. He'd been asking himself the same question since Dalton had ridden away. He still didn't have a good answer. "Because it was right," he said finally. Clara shook her head. "That's not enough." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but it's all I've got." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then she sat down on the steps beside him, the blanket still wrapped tight around her shoulders. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said quietly. "After that night, after the fire, I thought you were just another coward who watched and did nothing." "I was," Caleb said. "No," Clara said. "You weren't. You tried. You rode out to warn us. That's more than most people would have done." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of work. "My mother used to say that the world is full of people who do nothing," Clara continued. "People who see terrible things and turn away because it's easier. She used to say that the ones who try, even if they fail, are the ones who matter." "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman," Caleb said. "She was," Clara said, her voice cracked slightly. "She was the best person I ever knew." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a watch, silver and tarnished, with a cracked face. He held it out to Clara. "I found this," he said, "after the fire, near the fence line. I've been carrying it ever since." Clara took the watch, her hands trembling. She turned it over, and Caleb saw the tears start to fall. "This was my father's," she whispered. "I know," Caleb said. "I saw the initials on the back. J.W. Jonathan Whitfield." Clara pressed the watch to her chest, her shoulders shaking. Caleb didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her. He just sat there, letting her cry. When she finally stopped, she wiped her eyes with the edge of the blanket and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For keeping it," she said. "For remembering." Caleb nodded. "I couldn't forget even if I tried." They sat in silence for a while longer. The night deepened around them, the stars shifting overhead, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, the tension between them seemed to ease. Just slightly. Just enough. I don't forgive you, Clara said suddenly. Caleb looked at her. I know. But I don't hate you either. That's more than I deserve, Caleb said. Clara smiled just a little. Maybe. She stood and wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. I'm going to stay for a while, if that's all right. It's all right, Caleb said. She nodded and turned toward the cabin, but before she went inside, she stopped and looked back at him. Caleb. Yes. You're not your father. The words hit him harder than he expected. He felt something in his chest loosen just a little, not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to it. Thank you, he said quietly. Clara nodded and went inside, closing the door behind her. Caleb sat on the porch for a long time after that, staring out at the dark hills. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain. He closed his eyes and let himself breathe. And for the first time in 8 years, the weight on his chest didn't feel quite so heavy. Days turned into weeks. Clara stayed. She mended clothes, planted seeds in the small garden near the cabin, and cooked meals that filled the house with warmth. She didn't talk much, but she didn't have to. Her presence was enough. Caleb worked the ranch, repairing fences and tending to the horses. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the hills. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. One morning, about a month after Dalton's visit, Caleb was out near the fence line when he saw the riders again. This time, there were more of them. At least a dozen, maybe more, all moving toward the ranch in a tight formation. Caleb's stomach dropped. He turned and ran toward the cabin. Clara, he shouted, get inside before it's too late. She was outside, hanging laundry on a line near the side of the house. She turned and saw the riders, and her face went pale. No, Caleb shouted. She dropped the laundry and ran toward the cabin. Caleb met her at the door, pushing her inside and slamming it shut behind them. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and moved to the window. The riders stopped about 50 feet from the cabin. Dalton was at the front, his face hard and unreadable. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him were men Caleb didn't recognize, hired guns, by the look of them, with cold eyes and hands that hovered near their weapons. Merrick, Dalton called out, come on out, let's talk like civilized men. Caleb didn't move. I've got a warrant this time, Dalton continued. Official and legal, you're harboring a fugitive. Hand her over, and we'll leave peacefully. Clara stood behind Caleb, her hands clenched into fists. Don't, she whispered, don't give me up. I'm not going to, Caleb said. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands. Dalton's eyes flicked to the weapon, but he didn't draw his own. This is your last chance, Merrick, Dalton said. Hand her over. No, Caleb said. Dalton sighed, then you leave me no choice. He raised his hand, and the men behind him started to move forward. And then, from the hills to the north, came the sound of more hoofbeats. Caleb's heart leapt. He turned and saw them, at least 20 riders, maybe more, coming down from the high ground. He recognized Harris at the front, and beside him were men from all the neighboring ranches, men who'd worked these lands for decades, men who remembered what it meant to stand for something. They spread out in a wide line, forming a barrier between Dalton's men and the cabin. None of them drew their weapons. They didn't have to. Harris rode forward and stopped a few feet from Dalton. Sheriff, he said, his voice calm but firm, I think it's time you left. Dalton's jaw tightened. This is official business, Harris. You're interfering with the law. The law, Harris said, ended the kind of business you're trying to conduct 6 years ago. We all know that. And we're not going to stand by and let you drag an innocent woman back to that barn. One of the other riders spoke up. Cole, I branded calves with you 20 years ago. Don't make me choose between you and what's right." Dalton looked around at the men, his face red with anger, but he didn't draw his gun. He couldn't, not against this many. "You're making a mistake," Dalton said, his voice low. "Maybe," Harris said, "but it's ours to make." Dalton stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and spurred it forward, riding back toward town. His men followed, casting dark looks over their shoulders as they went. The ranchers stayed until Dalton and his men were out of sight. Then Harris rode up to the porch and tipped his hat to Caleb. "You all right?" he asked. "I am now," Caleb said. "Thanks, Harris." "Don't mention it," Harris said. He glanced at Clara, who had stepped out onto the porch beside Caleb. "Ma'am." Clara nodded, her eyes bright with tears. Harris and the others turned and rode off, disappearing back into the hills. Caleb stood on the porch, watching them go, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Clara touched his arm. "They came for you." "They came for us," Caleb said. She smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. The weeks turned into months. Clara stayed. She worked the garden until it bloomed with vegetables and wildflowers. She learned to ride one of the horses, a gentle mare named Rosie, and she talked more, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. Caleb built 2 small wooden crosses near the fence line and carved the names by hand: Mary Whitfield, Thomas Whitfield. Clara stood beside him when he planted them in the ground, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's not enough," Caleb said. "No," Clara agreed, "but it's something." One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills gold, Clara turned to Caleb and said, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Caleb asked. "To forgive you," she said. Caleb's throat tightened. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not just trust, not just acceptance. "Please, I don't deserve it," he said. "Maybe not," Clara said, "but I'm giving it anyway." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. They stood there together, watching the sun set over the valley, and Caleb felt the weight on his chest finally lift. Not gone, it would never be completely gone, but lighter. Enough to breathe. Enough to live. Years later, people would talk about the rancher who'd stood against the law for a woman who had every reason to hate him. They'd talk about the neighbors who'd ridden down from the hills, not because they were heroes, but because they were decent. And they'd talk about Clara Whitfield, who'd found a way to forgive the son of the man who'd destroyed her family. But Caleb never talked about it. He just kept working the ranch, tending to the land, and watching the crosses near the fence line weather with time. And every evening, as the sun dipped low, he'd sit on the porch beside Clara, and they'd watch the light fade together. In silence. In peace. At last.